Hi, welcome to today's webinar, Cubism. I have Excel, I need PerformancePoint, I don't know analysis services. My name is Chris McNulty, and I'm presenting today's webinar as part of the European SharePoint Conference Series. A little bit of background on me. I am currently CTO for Windows Systems Management at Dell Software. Prior to joining what was then Quest, I spent a number of years in the Northeast US running a SharePoint consultancy. I've been working with SharePoint at this point for over 13 years in a variety of capacities, principally with consulting and large systems. I live just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, here in the USA. I'm really happy to be coming to speak to you today, in part because this will be my first chance to speak to you since being awarded Microsoft's MVP award for SharePoint. I always want to just introduce two things. First, obviously, my company, Dell Software. There's a broad range of solutions that we bring to the portfolio for management, migration, and customization. For more information, I'd encourage you to visit our website at quest.com/SharePoint. And lastly, of course, my family, who puts up with me while I'm traveling around the world doing and indulging my passion for speaking about SharePoint. I was lucky enough to be able to bring them over to the UK earlier this year in conjunction with the conference. That's my wife Haley and my three kids pictured here. I'm looking forward very much to seeing all of you in Barcelona next May 2014. Today we're going to be walking through a couple of key things on business intelligence for SharePoint. First, we'll talk about how BI fits into the SharePoint roadmap with Microsoft. Secondly, I'm going to introduce what's required in the scenario. We're going to be starting with Excel and we're going to end up with PerformancePoint and what we need to enable to make that work. First two parts of the process, we're going to clean up the Excel file and bring that Excel file into SQL Server. Then we'll round up by bringing that data from SQL Server over to an analysis services cube. And lastly, take that cube, light it up in PerformancePoint, and attach it to a dashboard in SharePoint. A couple of things we are not going to be able to go through today, obviously. We're not going to have time to plunge into PowerView, which is an alternate BI technology, also using Excel. And for the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to assume that your BI solution is already properly installed, as is SQL, and obviously not going through any of our products today. So business intelligence has been around for a while, going back to the days of green bar paper. The first goal has always been with us, answering questions we know that we need to know. It's the second goal that's remained elusive over the past several decades, which is how do we help users find answers to problems we didn't know they were going to be asking when we set the system up in the first place. Microsoft has thrown a broad arsenal of solutions at it. Foundationally, they start with SQL Server, which handles most of the raw data storage in the database engine, as well as movement with integration and the slicing and dicing, forming cubes in analysis services. Excel is also considered the principal end-user BI tool in the world to allow users to explore data and model it using tools like PowerView and PowerPivot. And lastly, SharePoint provides the means to take that information and share it to a broader audience through tools like PerformancePoint. Microsoft also would ask us to distinguish personal business intelligence, which is usually Excel-centric, and on the right, corporate business intelligence, which is usually professionally written by a professional developer, and some level of self-service implementation. One of the things I'm hoping to do in today's webinar is break down some of that barrier between self-service and corporate BI to show you that without writing code, you can create a corporate solution to allow users to deliver their own self-service and self-analysis in a shared fashion on top of SharePoint. This has been Microsoft's roadmap for business intelligence in SharePoint. The blue line represents SharePoint 2010. So originally there was a chart web part, but a growing range of complexity and power moving through Excel services to some of the integrated technologies like BCS and SQL reporting services, moving on up through PerformancePoint and custom solutions. When Microsoft released SQL 2012, they also brought in two additional elements that are there to empower self-service. Obviously, alerts as part of reporting services, and self-service in PowerView, which is the new version of PowerPivot. So here's the scenario, and it was actually proposed to me last year by a community member, Jeff Vorosky. We were talking about cubes and how analysis services cubes exist inside Project Server, but you can create a cube that isn't that hard. And Jeff said to me he'd never created a cube before, which is where we came up with this scenario. This is a real-world scenario. It actually has happened to me several times. Someone on the business side comes in and says, I've heard there's this BI thing called PerformancePoint for dashboards. I've got some data in Excel. Can I give it to you and see what we can do with it in PerformancePoint? Now, the process we're going to take is going to move that through Analysis Services. Why? PerformancePoint is a dashboarding tool, and it can consume data from a number of sources, like Excel, like reporting services, but it does best with SSAS, because Analysis Services provides that rich drill-down capability that would be too hard to do otherwise. And we'll talk a little bit about data cubes. Data cubes are data matrices that have been built for rapid access to the data. The process we're going to go through, 12 steps. We're going to start in Excel. We'll get the file ready in Excel. Then we're going to take that cleaned up file, import it into SQL Server, and create a view on the SQL side. Next, most of the fun happens inside of Analysis Services. And for those of you who may never have fired up Visual Studio before, nothing bad is going to happen to you today. No harm will come to you, and this is a fun way for you to get your hands dirty on some of the tools that developers use every day. We're going to create a project. We're going to bring the data from SQL Server into an Analysis Services cube. We're going to set up queries and dimensions and deploy the cube back into SQL. Lastly, once that's done, it's a matter of taking PerformancePoint. We're going to set up a connection to that data to create a chart, and then attach that chart to a dashboard so I can deploy it to SharePoint. 12 steps. What's involved in the environment? Well, the environment we're looking at today is based on SQL Server 2012 with Analysis Services running on top of it, but this is important. We're going to be running in a single server build. And if you are doing that, it is very important that you also download the last version of SQL Server's support libraries, specifically the SQL 2008 R2 ADOMD.NET libraries. It's not documented, but if you don't have those enabled, the dashboard designers that we're going to be using won't be able to see Analysis Services. So a quick tip there. We're obviously going to be on SharePoint 2013. On SharePoint 2013, we're not going to go into all of the shared services that are deployed there, but we're making heavy use of the Secure Store, because the Secure Store stores the credentials for the PerformancePoint unattended service account. Lastly, if you were to proceed on from this and take that Analysis Services data and bring it into PowerView, you'd be doing that on top of Excel 2013. Excel 2013 has the support for Power Pivot pre-installed. It's a COM add-in. Nothing else needs to be downloaded. And that's all we need to make this solution work. It's also worth noting that the core techniques we're using here are equally relevant if you're running SQL Server 2008 R2 and SharePoint 2010. The same techniques basically work. There's a couple of variations in what things are called. It's called Business Intelligence Developer Studio when it comes time, not data tools, but we'll cover that when it's there. The first thing we're going to do is start inside of Excel. We want to inspect that file because it's come from a user and we're not sure what the structure of it is. We want to make sure all the columns line up. We want to make sure that the column names are good because they're going to be ultimately viewable to the end users of our system. And I'm going to do a couple of things here just to illustrate how dimensions get created. First, we're going to create an arbitrary ID field. We want a unique identifier for each row in the table. That's going to speed up the process later on when we're grabbing sets of data of how we reach out and grab that from the file. And then in the source, I'm going to add some synthetic measures for year, for quarter, and month, so I can build those into dimensions. We want to provide those tags, those handles, that will allow us not just to filter and sort, but to aggregate very quickly by any of those progressive measures in there. So let's take a look at Excel. So here's my environment. We're going to be doing some work. This is the Excel file that has come over from a user. We can see we've got some orders and some products and some fields that I don't really like in there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to transform this, and I'll transform it actually by just jumping to a completed version of the file rather than having you watch me type. So if I open this up, the cleaned up version of the file looks something like this. So if I jump up through it, what you'll see I've done here is we've stripped out all the header information and I've arbitrarily added a 5-digit number starting with 10,001 and copied it all the way down. I've changed the name of what was called text geocode to call it customer region. And I've added a couple of fields here to look at the date of the order and just give me a year, a quarter, calendar quarter, and a month. Copy that all the way down, and that's the change that I want to make to my source data here. Relatively straightforward. Next, we're going to take that data, we're going to bring it into SQL Server. And it's very important, when we bring it into SQL Server, we're going to a non-SharePoint database. We'll be using a tool called the Export-Import Wizard, which is a very simple version of SQL Server Integration Services. It's a good first place to start. We will use currency fields, and we're going to check to make sure that dates are coming over as dates and money is coming over properly, and save the package appropriately. Next, still inside of SQL Server, the other step I'm going to take is I'm going to create a view. A view is not strictly needed, but a view you can think of, if you're not a DBA, is a query that's built inside of SQL Server. And it runs inside SQL Server, and what it returns looks like a table, looks like a data set that came off of a table, but it's not. What I can do then is for anything I'm doing, remember of the 12 steps, everything down the road that's reaching into Analysis Services, this view will become the consistent source that Analysis Services is always tapping into. So if I get another version of that Excel spreadsheet and it has some different fields in it, I can, by just adjusting this query, make sure that dynamically I'm pulling out a data set that matches what Analysis Services is expecting. So let's go over to SQL Server. As I noted, here inside of SQL Server, we want to make sure that we start with a database that I control. We can't put this into a content database, obviously. Microsoft doesn't support adding information to the schema. What I want to do in this database is I want to import the file. I'm going to use the Import Data Wizard. It's going to ask me what kind of file I have. Let me just do this quickly. Make sure I closed my Excel files so there's no contention. Okay. Importing data. The import wizard asks us what kind of file this is. This is an Excel file. We tell it where it is. First row has column names. That's why it was important to clean that up. And what database is it going to? Since I had focus set on the MSS external database, which is a database I created a couple months ago, that's where it thinks it's going to go. And we have the option of copying data or writing a query. We're going to copy data. And here I'm just going to grab the full version of orders. And I'm going to say what I want you to do is bring that over to orders 2014 ESPC. Create a new table from this. Let's take a look at what I said before, edit mappings. We want to make sure that it sees the structure and it knows what it wants to create. If I were going through this a second or third time, I might be re-importing data to to a pre-existing table. But here I need to create the table on the fly. If I'm looking at some of these things, I'll see, for example, that the total dollar value of the order is coming through as float. I want to change that to a currency value. And I could change the order year to make it varchar. For those of you who aren't familiar, varchar is a placeholder that could hold any type of character, but we'll just keep it the way it is right now. We want to just make one change. We take a look at the mappings. We take a look at the preview and just make sure that the data is coming over properly structured. Yes, SQL Server can see it looking something like Excel. Take the next step. And here we see that there is a field value that's changing. And because I'm doing a conversion, we have the potential to lose data or have an error. SQL Server wants to know what we should do with this, and it wants to be very protective, so its default behavior is to fail. We're going to tell SQL Server to ignore that error globally. So if there's any data that gets lost or missing, it's going to follow the global rules, which is to ignore the error and continue on. We could save this as a package if I expected to run this over and over again, but right now we're just going to run it immediately. We finish it, and it should run out and bring in all of our table rows. Okay. The next thing I want to do is create a view. In this case, to create a new view, SQL Server calls up a design surface. It just shows us what tables are out there. We're going to add that. Tell it we want to get all columns. And we can hit, that's really all there is to it. We want to execute this, see that it's bringing back all the rows. That's great. And we're done. We can save this. It's going to ask us for a name of the view, and I can call this view orders ESPC. And the view is out there. Now, I mentioned earlier one of the reasons why we create a view is so that on successive imports, we wouldn't have to change anything else. So if I refresh this view here, you'll see that there's now two predefined SQL views that are out there, the one we just created and one that was already there. Orders SSAS, if I were to design that, and that's already pulling from a table called orders import. If I wanted to pull it from a different table, tell it I want you to pull from orders 2014 ESPC, and I wanted to rename a field here, I could use the as sequence and call it order no, if that's the field value I had to match. So this is where I would come to adjust a view over time if I expected to do any of those things. I don't need to do any of those things right now. I'm not going to save this change, but that's where the view is stored and defined. So now we move into the heavy lifting part of today's presentation, SQL Server Analysis Services, SSAS. To do that, we're going to open up a tool, which is a subset of Visual Studio called SQL Server Data Tools in 2012. If you're looking for it in older versions of SQL, it's called Business Intelligence Data Services. We're going to create a new project. When we tell data tools that we're creating a new project, we're going to create a multi-dimensional template. And we're going to say that project, once it's created, is going to be deployed to an analysis services database. So an analysis services database is totally different from those database engine databases we were just looking at. It's a different entity entirely. So we'll come in, we will tell our project where a data source lives, what's the name of the database. Then we're going to tell it within that database, we're going to create a data source view to tell it of the tables and view structures that are out there, which one is going to be our live data source. The next step here, I'm going to create named queries in my data source view. Named queries are a way to pull out the summary of all of the field values in each of the dimensions that I want to group by. And it is a step in the way to building and optimizing the creation of those data dimensions. I want to be able to group by products. I want to be able to group by where the order came from, and I want to be able to group by the time of the order. So I want to create queries to represent all those sorts of things. Named queries are just logically defined in the analysis services structure. They do not perform as well as when you can make those table structures directly in the source data. However, in many scenarios, you'll be working against a data environment like SQL Server that might be a line of business source where I can't go in and just add tables to the schema. So named queries are a way to bridge that gap. I'm going to create those queries. We're going to point back to the master primary key in the source table that we brought in and create those to correspond to each one of the dimensions that I want to push out there. Then I'm going to create a cube. And in the cube is going to ask me where is my master table that has the things that I want to summarize. And the things that I want to summarize are how many orders did I have and what was the total money value of those orders. and I can adjust those measures if they look like there's something that users may not understand. Once the cube is built, I'm going to add dimensions to it. We're going to add a single dimension of product, since we only care about finding the product. Then I'm going to start adding some hierarchies. So with geography in my data, I have regions, and inside regions I may have states. So I'm going to build a two-dimensional geography dimension and then a multi-dimension time thing. I'm going to start with year, then drill to quarter, then below that put month, and then below that I'm going to put date. Finally, once all that is done, we build the cube and we deploy it back to Analysis Services from inside Studio. And we can take a look at it and make sure that all those numbers are properly formatting inside of the cube before we jump over to SharePoint. So let's take a look at that inside of SQL Server Data Tools. So SQL Server Data Tools is also installed here. You'll see it comes up with this little Visual Studio message. And the first thing I want to do is create a new project. And this is going to be an Analysis Services multi-dimensional project. And let's call this Orders 2014. And so the project's out there. And since we told it it was an Analysis Services project, Visual Studio knows the kinds of things that we want to create. So the first thing I want to do is create a data source. And so here is a relatively short wizard. I'm going to step over. I'm going to say I want to create a new data source. I'll tell it the name of the server. If you're on a large network, do not browse. It will take a while before you get control back. But I know what server I'm pointing to. And here I want to find a database. And the database is MSS External. I'm going to use the service account to connect to it. And I'm going to call this DS External. Next, I'm going to create the data source view. And the data source view is very similar. It reaches out to the relational data source, and it asks me within that, do I want to create logical relationships? I don't. What objects are out there? And here is the view that I want to work with, the master view, which was previously built and properly structured to avoid the risk that I've mistyped something here in today's demo. Call this DS View Orders 2014. Okay, so I now see a map of what data I have. So the very first thing I want to do here, I want to make sure that that order number is set to be a logical primary key. Now I want to start creating some new named queries. And this is probably the most code you may have to write today. Here on the named query, it's going to ask me, what table do I want? We can give it the view, which I've created, view orders SSAS. And here I just want to get product and order number. And it reminds me that I need to give it a name query for products. So I have that done, and then I just want to point back product, map product in that query to product in my data source to make sure it understands the mapping structure that's out there. And I can go on and continue to make those changes. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump this forward a little bit and just open up a project where this is already built. So here in my data source view, already set up name queries for some of the things that I need to represent. The next thing I've done is I've created a new cube. And in that cube, I want to base this on an existing table, which is my data source view. And the master table has the numbers that I want to aggregate. So that's the measure group that I care about. And when it shows me the measure group, it's going to show me a few things. It's going to show me the total value of the orders that's correct. And it sees that the year is a number. And it's asking me if it wants to group those. I don't really care about the year. The fact that I had an order, if I had 2 sales of hula hoops, one in 2001 and one in 2003. The fact that those numbers add up to 4,004 is totally meaningless. So I'm going to hide that. But this one I might choose to rename. By right mouse clicking on it, I could call this order count. And this cube already has some dimensions that are defined. How did those get there? Let's cancel out of that. Well, I've already come here and set up new dimensions. So one way that I could create a new dimension is by highlighting this and saying I want to add a new dimension. In this case, let's create a new dimension for region. How would you like to create the dimension? We're going to use an existing table. And the dimension, it sees what the main table is, view orders SSAS. It's important that there's a key column because you can't create a dimension if you haven't created a key column. What are the key attributes of this dimension? Well, here I know that I care about the customer state and the customer region. And let's call this Geo Demo. So the region designer is shown here. To create a new hierarchy, drag an attribute here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the region over into that space. Then I'm going to drag the customer state and I'm going to drop it below because regions are going to live as the container inside which I'm going to find a state. That's really all there is to it. So I don't want to accidentally run with duplicate dimensions out there. So let me just delete this. And we should be ready to build our cube. So the cube right now has no data in it. It knows where to go get it, and it knows how to process all that information, but it hasn't been processed yet. So since I've played around with the structure, I want to take a look and process this cube, which will remind me that the server looks like it's out of date. Do you want to build and deploy the project first? No. The reason why I said no is I want to see where this is going to go. In creating the project, I look at project properties, and one of the key things I want to see is the deployment settings for this. The settings for what I'm saying is this analysis services database, I have to define an analysis services engine, which coincidentally is the same as my database engine, but in your environment they could be on different machines. And what's the name of the cube database that I want to deploy that to? So that's already been configured properly. So now all I need to do is come back here, restart process, be prompted to build and deploy the project. And it's reminding me that the database has changed since last deployed. Would you like to continue? Yes. Deploying and processing. And we got a little check mark telling us that everything was good in the deployment. Now I'm going to process the cube by running it. And we know that the process succeeded, and the trace information follows along a little bit behind. So we have been successful. So the last thing I want to do is just inspect that cube right here and make sure that the data that's in it is something I can work with. So I'm going to refresh this view, open the cube, and I see over here this last tab is called Browser. Here inside the cube, I can see levels or measures that I can drag over and play with the dimensions. So let's do that. Let's go look at the stats for this order. Let's look at the total dollar value of all the orders in this data set. We see it's 27,256 and some other dimensions that are out there. Let's just check and see if I go grab product and drag that in here, I'll see I dynamically restructure that, and now I can see what products I have out there. If I wanted to play with geography, I could just grab the region code. This is what I would expect. The cube is running totally fine and it's been deployed. So that tells me it's time for us to finish up by going into SharePoint. The SharePoint side is relatively easy. I'm going to create a new, using a tool inside of the Business Intelligence Center, I'm going to create a new PerformancePoint object called an analytic chart. To do that, I create a connection to the cube that I just created, and then in the chart, it's relatively straightforward. I'm going to define a measure, which is going to be my data series, and in this case it's going to be the total dollar value of the orders, and then whatever dimension I want to start grouping by, I'm going to put along the bottom axis. That'll give me a chart. The last thing I do, also inside of the designer, is I'm going to create a new dashboard, which is a container that I can put other other PerformancePoint objects into, and use it to deploy back to SharePoint so users can see that in their browser. Relatively straightforward. Let's get to that. So if I come into SharePoint, I'm going to move to a page where I've already configured a site using the Business Intelligence Center template. And if I come here to PerformancePoint content, I'll see some objects that have already been pushed out there before. And I could come here and just launch directly from this a tool called the Dashboard Designer. And it's asking me, do you want to open this application? Yes. So this can be launched from inside the browser, and then it runs like it's a desktop app, but it's dependent on having a browser connection out to what you're doing. And here it is. So the very first thing I want to do here is create a new data connection, new data source. And this is the place, remember earlier where I said you need to make sure you have the SQL 2008 R2 ADOMD libraries available? If you haven't installed those, you're going to run into a couple of issues here. So here I can see Analysis Services is a kind of data source that we support. And it says, what server am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for SP 2013 demo. And what's the database? And if you don't see anything show up in this drop-down, it's because you don't have the library support. But that's the name of the Analysis Services database. And then here, it's asking me which cube do I want. An Analysis Services database can contain multiple cubes. Ours only has one, but in the real world, you'll see multiple cubes typically being built by a professional developer. And if I want to, I can rename this data source ESPC14 to distinguish it from other demos I've done here before. And I can save that, and I'm good to go. Now for PerformancePoint content, I'm going to want to create a new chart. So I come up to the ribbon at the top and say I want to create a new analytic chart. A wizard comes up, and this is a very simple wizard. It asks me, what's my data source for this? And I click Finish. The analytic chart designer takes over the screen. And so I said before, I'm going to take the measure, order total, drag it down here by series, and let's take the dimension. And I've done an awful lot with product dimensions. Let's go grab the customer region. Put it along the bottom axis. And it's going to show me where all of those sales are coming from. I now have an analytic chart. I'm going to give it a slightly different name, ESPC chart, and save it. The last thing I need to do is create a new dashboard. So I'm going to right mouse click on PerformancePoint content, create a new dashboard, pick a page layout. These are kind of like web part pages if you're familiar with SharePoint Designer. So this is going to be relatively simple. I'm only going to put one thing on the dashboard. 2 rows. I'm going to have 2 pages. Just to show you the multi-tabbed side, I have a master one page here. And let's put another one. This one can use columns for page 2, but I'm not going to put anything on it. So here I have master. And over here on the right side of the screen, under reports, I can see the Performance Point content I've created. I just want to drag it in here. Now I recognize we're taking some shortcuts here. You can do a lot of integration between the elements of these pages. But today I just want to get this out there and get this deployed. So the dashboard is there. I can give it a different name. Dash. It's going to ask me where should it be deployed to. Which document library do I want to push this out to? In BI, there's a library for dashboards. That seems fine. I'll use the default site master page. And if I have multiple pages, do I want to include that for navigation? Absolutely. So that's done. I can save it. But dashboards are unique. It's the one place where I need to make sure I actually deploy something instead of just saving it. So again, by right mouse clicking here to this, I click on this and it says deploy to SharePoint. And lo and behold, here's our analytic chart. Hooray! If I click on the name of it, it will go to full screen view, so I can play with it some more. And we know that this is running in PerformancePoint against Analysis Services because I can take advantage of some of the dynamic restructuring here. I can change this on the fly to make it look like a pie chart. Let's go back. That's not the most useful view. But if I want to see this giant block in eastern US, what is that comprised of? So let's say I want to drill down into that. I could. I can also use the Decomposition Tree. So Decomposition Tree is an element of PerformancePoint that lets you look at a block and break it down into its constituents. So here, with 22,000 of sales in the eastern US, I can then click on it and say, I want you to break this out by product. And show me it right there. And it'll show me dynamically I have 10K in sales for hula hoop, 10K in sales for the A55 air transport. I'm very curious about the hula hoop sales. So I could then drill in further and say I want to break this out by year. And I can see that most of my hula hoop sales were concentrated in the year 2011. But my air transport sales were concentrated in 2010. And specifically, it looks like there was just one sale which pushed those numbers up. So that's a way that people can go back and find information about the data without my needing to think of every possible query or exploration that someone wants to take on their path through things. So just to recap, we started in Excel, we clean up the file, we bring it over into SQL, create a view, we jump over to Analysis Services, set up a new project, create sources to the data, build out the queries, cubes, and dimensions, and deploy it back. Then finally finish up in SharePoint with Dashboard Designer to set a connection to the data, build a chart, and push that out as a dashboard. Just one closing thought today about what I like to do is remind people of what I call the carousel paradox. Most business data begins at some point in its life in Excel. If we are not careful, we run the great risk of giving people data that looks exactly the same way as it came in. For those of you who have been on a carousel or a merry-go-round, you should be familiar with the fact that when you get on them, it may seem like a trivial trip, but you should emerge somewhat transformed. You may be happy, you may be ill, you may be ready to go home, but you've looked at the world through 360 degrees and hopefully emerged somewhat the better for it. It is really important when you design your systems that you not give systems that spit data back to people in exactly the same format that they gave it to you in the first place. It's important to take that data on a journey. So this tells me our time is done. Thank you very much for watching today's webcast. To get in touch with me, please use my email address at dell.com or any of the blog entries here, and of course Twitter is as good a place to reach me as any. I'm looking very much forward to seeing you all next spring in Barcelona as part of the European Share Conference. Thank you very much.